Today's feast, the elevation or exaltation of the precious cross, is one of the 12 great feasts of the church year. The Lord's precious cross is a supreme symbol of sacrifice and sanctification for the Church of Christ, who was crucified and then rose. Because the cross, together with the resurrection, are the two pillars which support the life of the church and its faithful. The honor paid by the Orthodox Church to the precious cross on September 14th, though not only in just that day, began in the very, very early apostolic years through the apostles themselves and the fathers who followed them. Today, the Orthodox Church preserves intact the biblical and patristic teaching of the ancient Christianity and accords to the cross of Christ due honor as a supreme instrument and symbol of the redemption of the human race. In 326 AD, just 1 year after the Council of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council, the Empress Helen, the mother of Constantine the Great, went to the Holy Land. And she began constructing magnificent churches in the holy places where, according to tradition, events linked to the presence of the Lord on earth and other biblical occurrences had taken place. Central among these churches was the Lord's Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. You've all heard of how Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD during the Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire. But there was a second revolt by Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century in 135 AD, in which the city was just totally destroyed. And Jews were forbidden to even set foot in Jerusalem by edict of the Roman Empire. Eusebius of Caesarea, the father of church history in the 4th century in his ecclesiastical history, tells us that from that year, the bishops of Jerusalem were no longer Jewish, but Gentiles, because the Roman Empire wouldn't allow Jews to set foot in the holy city. And in that year, the Emperor Hadrian, who put down the second revolt, constructed a temple dedicated to Aphrodite, to Venus, on the site of where the early Christians had gone to worship at the tomb of our Lord. He earthed over the sites of Golgotha and Bethlehem, the cave where Jesus was born. The Christians all knew where these sites were. So he covered them over and he built pagan temples on top of them. But in a sense, he did us a favor because he marked the spots. So the Christians knew exactly where to go when Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, to tear down the pagan temples and to establish Christian churches. When they tore down the temple of Venus, Aphrodite, that was built over the Holy Sepulchre, St. Helen began an archaeological dig to find the precious cross. And they found an old well where 3 crosses had been thrown. And they took out the 3 crosses, the Lord's and those of the 2 thieves. And the sign that was above our Lord's head was there also, but it had been separated from the cross. And they didn't know which one was our Lord's cross. So according to church tradition, Archbishop Macarius of Jerusalem, having first said a prayer, brought the body of a woman who had just died to all 3 of the crosses. And when she was placed on the 3rd cross, the Lord's, when the cross was touched her, she revived. According to church tradition, St. Helen then embraced the cross immediately after its discovery and gave it over to Bishop Macarius. And the news spread to all parts of Jerusalem and huge crowds began to flock to the site to touch the precious cross. But because of the sheer weight of the multitudes, the bishop mounted to a high place, and he raised the cross on high and blessed the people with it. On that same day, on this same feast day, we also celebrate a second elevation of the cross, which occurred just a few years later, in 335 AD, when the Emperor Constantine and his mother Helen had consecrated the Church of the Resurrection, the Anastasis, the original Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the tomb of Christ was at the center of the church. It was not built like an ordinary church. It was built with columns and had large outdoor courts to accommodate the huge numbers of people that couldn't fit within a building. And finally, on this day, the church also records a third and final elevation of the precious cross in the year 630 AD. At that time, the Byzantine Emperor, East Roman Emperor Heraclius, was fighting in a world war with the Zoroastrian Persian Empire. This is before the advent of Islam, just a generation before. And the pagan Persian Empire was the other superpower in the early Middle Ages in the Eastern Mediterranean. It encompassed everything that's Iran, Iraq, parts of Syria, parts of Saudi Arabia, parts of Pakistan. It was a huge empire. But they were Zoroastrians. They worshipped fire. And they made war on Christians. And this huge war that had erupted caused the Persian armies to completely overrun the Middle East, which at that time was entirely Christian. The Persian armies went all the way to Egypt, all the way to the walls of Constantinople, which held. The Persians allied themselves with a huge pagan barbarian nation from the Russian steppes called the Avars, who attacked from the Balkans. It looked like all was lost. But Heraclius, who was governor of North Africa, the area of Tunisia and Algeria, an area that the Emperor Justinian had reconquered and was now part of the East Roman Empire, he arrived with a fleet of ships and armies and drove back the Persians. This is a war that lasted 30 years. Almost every church in the Holy Land was destroyed by the occupying Persian army. One church that was spared was the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And the only reason they spared that 4th century church built by Constantine and his mother was because it had a huge mosaic of the wise men bringing gifts to our Lord, dressed as Zoroastrian priests. And when they saw their own priests in that church, they decided to spare that church. Monks and nuns were slaughtered everywhere. Christians suffered terribly. But when the Persians sacked Jerusalem, they took the Holy Cross as a war trophy. They took it back to their capital, Ctesiphon, just 22 miles from Baghdad. And they kept it there to show Zoroastrian triumph over the Christians. But when the Emperor Heraclius drove the Persian armies back, he took the war all the way back to their own capital. And when they sued for peace, he recovered the cross. I should say it wasn't the whole cross. When the Empress Helen unearthed the cross, she and Constantine had it divided into 3 pieces. One piece went to the Church of the Holy Cross in Rome that she built. 1/3 went to New Rome, Constantinople. So the third that was taken by the Persians was taken from the Holy Sepulchre. So the Emperor Heraclius brought back the cross to Jerusalem. And the Patriarch, Zechariah of Jerusalem, who had been carried off as a slave by the Persian armies together with the population of Jerusalem, he also freed him and brought back the Christians who were held captive in the Persian Empire and returned them to Jerusalem. So on September 14th, he came to Jerusalem bearing the cross on his shoulders. And church tradition says that he was unable to enter the city. There was like a force field that kept him from entering the gates of the city until he removed his crown and took off his boots and entered as a simple pilgrim and not as an East Roman emperor. And he brought the cross and he gave it to the patriarch Zechariah, who was restored. And he again ascended the high place, and he lifted the cross so all could see it, that it was restored in Jerusalem. And for the first time the Troparion was sung, O Lord, save your people and bless your inheritance. So that's where the Troparion comes from. It comes from 630 AD, when they celebrated the recovery of the cross. Sources of ecclesiastical history mention that the Feast of the Elevation was established long ago, perhaps even by Constantine the Great, at the exhortation of his mother, Helen, immediately after the discovery of the precious cross in Jerusalem in about 330 AD. And in combination with the feast we also commemorate the inauguration of the Church of the Resurrection that they built, which pilgrims from all over the Roman Empire and beyond came to venerate the resurrection of Christ. It was completed on the 13th of May in the year 335. But the church moved it to this day in honor of the Lord's elevation of the cross. And during the Divine Liturgy, the epistle reading concerns the importance of the Lord's sacrifice on the cross, while the Gospel describes scenes of the crucifixion. Moreover, the day has been declared a strict fast day. So yesterday, the actual day, this is the after feast today, was a fast day because of Christ's sacrifice, making it a second Holy and Great Friday. The connection between the Feast of the Transfiguration and that of the elevation of the precious cross is also worth noting, because the Transfiguration occurs exactly 40 days before our Lord's Passion. But the church celebrates it on August 6th, 40 days before this elevation of the cross, because it would have been difficult to celebrate the Feast of the Transfiguration during the solemn period of Great Lent. So as we just said, the Feast of the Elevation of the Precious Cross is equal to Great Friday. The Feast of the Transfiguration was fixed, being 40 days before it, on August 6th. On the occasion of the discovery and elevation of the Lord's precious cross, the Lord shows all of us, the way of life we should be leading, so that we can be crucified together with Christ to this world, and then raised in newness of life. We should draw strength and grace from this. Christ's cross is a symbol of obedience, of humility and love. It's the sign of victory over hatred, self-centeredness, sin, the passions, and egotism. Let us also struggle insofar as we can to imitate him and obey him. Let us imitate his humility, his obedience, and also his love, which was the same for everyone, for his disciples, and even for those who crucified him, and which remained with him even on the cross. Let us pass the remaining time of our lives in peace and repentance, faithfully serving our Lord as the focal point of our lives. Let us love him and serve him with such love and zeal that we can truly say with the Holy Apostle Paul, as we heard in today's Apostle reading, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. In the name of the Father, and the Son,